The Divergent franchise was always kind of the black sheep when it came to young adult movies we got around the 2010s. It constantly got compared to the Hunger Games franchise and was always overshadowed by other films at the time that simply did the YA dystopian fantasy romance better. Although it has its fans, it never managed to complete the story the filmmakers set out to tell, and it was cancelled with one movie still left. So today I want to examine the last film in the series, Allegiant, to understand how it killed the franchise, and why we never got to see the ending to these characters' stories. To understand how Allegiant became a franchise killer, we need to familiarize ourselves with the victim. In other words, we need to know the background of the Divergent film franchise. It all started back in 2011 when Summit Entertainment picked up the rights to Veronica Roth's young adult novel, Divergent, which follows the story of Beatrice Pryor in a dystopian Chicago. They actually picked up the rights before the first book was even published. Summit Entertainment is the production company behind the Twilight adaptations, so it made sense that they would want to find their next big YA novel to adapt, since that franchise was coming to an end. In 2012, Neil Burger was brought in to direct, and Evan Daughtry co-wrote the screenplay with Vanessa Taylor. Shailene Woodley was cast as the lead, and a year later, Theo James was cast as the love interest for. Other big-name stars filled out the rest of the cast, such as Miles Teller, Ansel Elgort, Zoe Kravitz, Jai Courtney, and Kate Winslet. Originally, the budget for Divergent was $40 million. However, after the success of the first Hunger Games movie in 2012, the budget was bumped up to $80 million instead. Nearly the entire film was shot in Chicago in 2013, with some minor reshoots in the beginning of 2014 in LA. During the production of the film, Summit Entertainment also greenlit 2 sequels, Insurgent and Allegiant, so they must have been pretty confident that the film would be a hit. And they were right, as Divergent debuted #1 in the box office on March 21st of 2014. It went on to make $150 million in the US and $137 million overseas, for a total worldwide gross of $288 million. And against a budget of $80 million, plus $50 million for marketing, that meant this film was a success. Obviously not Hunger Games or Twilight levels, but still a decent amount. Although the reviews were a bit mixed, the important part is that it hit with its core audience and made money. Summit Entertainment was already working hard on the sequel, as Insurgent was already in pre-production while Divergent was in post-production. All of the cast returned for the sequel, however, the second film got both a new director and new writers. Brian Duffield wrote the script with some rewrites done by Akiva Goldsman later on. Neil Burger didn't return because he was finishing up editing on the first Divergent film. So, Robert Schwenke was brought in to direct both Insurgent and Allegiant. Production for Insurgent kicked off in May of 2014, which was just a few months after the first film debuted. One thing you'll notice between the two films is Beatrice has a new cut, which is because Shailene Woodley had to cut her hair for The Fault in Our Stars, which was filmed around the same time. This time around, the sequel was mostly shot in Atlanta, but they still did some shooting in Chicago like the first film. Additionally, the budget for the sequel was much bigger, at around $110 million, not including marketing. That, coupled with the third film already being greenlit, meant there was a little more pressure on this movie to perform just as well or better than the first movie. And luckily, it did. Insurgent debuted at #1 in the box office on March 30th of 2015, which was 1 year after the first film, to an opening weekend gross of $52 million. It went on to make $130 million in the US and $166 million overseas, for a total worldwide gross of $297 million. The reviews this time around were noticeably worse from both critics and fans. The more negative reaction from fans is because the film deviated from the source material, whereas the first Divergent film was a pretty accurate adaptation. But the sequel still made money, and it seemed like the fan base was still on board, so it was full steam ahead for this franchise. Which brings us to the final film in the series, and the franchise killer, Allegiant. As we know, the third film was greenlit all the way back in 2013, at the same time the second movie was greenlit. However, a year later in 2014, Summit Entertainment and the distributor for the Divergent films, Lionsgate, made the decision to split up the third and final book in the series into 2 separate movies. This was a trend we saw a lot during this time in Hollywood, with all these book adaptations, as all the cool kids were doing it. In 2014, we saw Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1 and 2. In 2011, we saw Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1 and 2. In 2010, we saw Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2. And The Hobbit took it even further by splitting the book into 3 movies. So obviously, Lionsgate and Summit Entertainment wanted to be like these other franchises and squeeze as much money as they could from the Divergent franchise without any concern for the artistic integrity of the project. But as we'll discuss later, this decision would bite them in the ass. In April of 2015, Jeff Daniels and Bill Skarsgård were added to the cast, and a month later the film went into production. Just like the second film, Allegiant was shot primarily in Atlanta, Georgia. During this time, the decision was also made to change the title of the 2 movies from the Divergent series Allegiant Part 1 and 2 to the Divergent series Allegiant and Ascendant. Allegiant debuted at number 2 in the box office right behind Zootopia and grossed $29 million in its opening weekend. Compared to the other 2 films, which made $50 million in their opening weekend, this was a sign of the poor box office to come. In the US, Allegiant made $66 million, and overseas it made $113 million for a total worldwide gross of $179 million. This was quite a step down from the other films, which grossed $288 million and $297 million. And with an estimated budget of around $110 to $142 million, that put Allegiant in the red. A common rule of thumb in the industry is that a film needs to make back at least 2 to 3 times its budget in order to make money, since that original budget figure doesn't account for marketing, distribution, the theater's cuts, and other such factors. The Hollywood Reporter estimated that the film lost nearly $50 million from this poor box office response. Not only was the box office bad, but the reviews were pretty rough, with a lot of the criticism pointed at the boring and cliche plot, and a lot of people agreeing that the franchise had overstayed its welcome. The actors in the series were also pretty disappointed with the outcome, as Shailene Woodley said in an interview with Net-a-Porter that she almost quit acting after the decline of the series. She said this: "The last one was a bit of a hard experience for everyone, and that was really what made me think I need to have some human experiences outside of this industry and fall in love with acting again." After the dust settled on the third film's release, the fourth and final film was pushed back from March of 2017 to June of 2017. A new director was also brought on board with Tolan Krieger after Robert Schwenke dropped out. In July of 2016, it was announced that the final Divergent movie would not have a theatrical release and be a TV movie instead, and it would lead into a TV series spin-off. A year later, in 2017, Shailene Woodley officially left the Divergent series as she didn't want to be a part of the TV movie or series and said that she would only be a part of the project if it had a theatrical release. Following Woodley's departure, more and more of the cast became less interested and dropped out as well. The final film and TV series slowly dissolved until they were officially canceled in December of 2018. And since that day, there has been no more news on any live-action Divergent adaptations, for better or for worse. Now that we're familiar with the victim and the killer, let's uncover the murder weapon. How did Allegiant kill this franchise? There's a lot of reasons we're going to explore on why this franchise failed, but let's just start with the most obvious one, and that's the decision to split the final book into 2 movies. Lionsgate and Summit Entertainment got a little too big for their britches and split the last film into 2 parts, when they never really needed to or should have. The only reason Harry Potter, Twilight, and Hunger Games pulled this off is because they were much bigger properties. Every single Harry Potter and Hunger Games movie made well over $500 million each, while not a single film in the Divergent franchise even cracked the $300 million mark. These other franchises have the brand recognition and status to pull this off, while Divergent simply doesn't. It's just embarrassing to look back and think about how these producers thought Divergent was as big as these other series. If they would have just made the third book a single movie, we would have a nice complete trilogy. But the decision to split it up resulted in this franchise not having a definitive end, which has contributed to its poor legacy. The criticism of this series has only grown in retrospect since it never finished its story and leaves on a cliffhanger. This series simply never had the chance to pull off a 2-parter, especially since the age of the young adult dystopian films were coming to an end. The subgenre as a whole was becoming less popular, and the final Hunger Games movie in 2015 was the last foray into this type of film for a lot of people. When you're most well known for being a Hunger Games clone, and then Hunger Games ends, The writing's on the wall that your time is up. The Divergent series was running on fumes at this point, and given that it was one of the most cliche franchises in this film subgenre, people didn't really care about a third film. The movies got worse and worse from each installment, and at this point, these production companies have to realize that people aren't going to show up if they don't put in the effort to make these movies good. And that's really the biggest problem with this series, is that the films aren't very good. No hate to you if you like these films, but as a whole, they are just very bland, boring, and derivative. I know calling these Hunger Games ripoffs has been said a million times. I mean, I've already compared the two franchises dozens of times in this video, but these comparisons are made for a reason. There are just too many similarities in the plot, the characters, and themes. And the Hunger Games movies do everything the Divergent series does, but they do it better. Good art should take something we know and transform it into something new and fresh. It needs to evolve. Divergent doesn't create anything new or transformative. It takes all the characters and tropes we're familiar with, throws a new coat of paint on it, and then passes it off as something different. Divergent did everything by the numbers, and that's why it's been forgotten. It also doesn't help that the actual Allegiant book wasn't well received by fans. I'm approaching this franchise from someone who isn't familiar with the source material, but based on what I've read from actual fans of the series, the last book is not well regarded in the community. So this animosity towards the final book may have contributed to a lot of the fans not seeing this in theaters. Another aspect which may have contributed to this film's poor box office is the overseas distribution. Unlike its predecessor, Insurgent, Lionsgate decided not to have a day and date release for Allegiant, instead intending to take advantage of various school holidays in international markets. So the rollout for Allegiant was staggered and inconsistent, which is just enough time for bad word of mouth and poor reviews online to reach anyone who may have been on the fence about seeing this film in theaters. That, coupled with the juggernaut of a film that was Zootopia, meant this film underperformed compared to what people thought it would do. Early predictions had this film at a $30 to $40 million opening weekend, but as we know, it squeaked out with only $29 million. Maybe if they put more effort into making the movies good, it would have had a chance to be successful, but I guess we'll never know. The Divergent series was destined for death. As the films progressively got worse, the YA subgenre was becoming less popular, and the accusations of being a Hunger Games ripoff just became more prevalent. Its death was only prolonged by the boneheaded decision to split the last book into two separate movies, which was the final nail in the coffin. They tried to save the series by making it into a TV movie, but the actors and the fans were over it, and the whole franchise quietly fizzled out. So that's why Allegiant claims the place as a franchise killer. What are your thoughts on the Divergent film series? Which movie or franchise do you want to see me cover next? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This has been Tom from Isenhart Productions, and thank you so much for watching. See you next week.